president cannot send his resources into.
Hello everyone, and warm welcome to this webinar where we will walk you through the new edition of the Ericsson Mobility Report. My name is Patrick Servo. I'm heading up Strategic Marketing Insights in Ericsson. I'm also the Executive Editor of the Ericsson Mobility Report. Together in this webinar and helping me to walk through some of the content, I have Peter Linder, who is the head of 5G marketing in North America. Also an honor to have Donna Johnson here, Vice President, Product and Solution Marketing from Cradlepoint, as well as Richard Meller, who is the Chief Analyst and the brain behind many of the forecasts and models that we are presenting today. So let's jump directly into this seminar, and just to say a few things. First of all, it's a 36-page report, as always, fully packed with a lot of data and insights. So we won't be able to go through all the details, but please have a look at the report and all the assets that we have online for you. Some of the highlights this time is really about the 5G subscription uptake. Right now we are on a rate on adding roughly 1 million 5G subscriptions a day globally in the world on 5G networks. And it's Northeast Asia, it's North America, and the Gulf countries that are really the lead here in terms of 5G subscription uptake, and expected to be now for the next coming years. And globally, we're also seeing that the average consumption over data continues to go up, and we just passed the point when the average smartphone user in the world actually used more than 10 gigabytes per month in data consumption, which is kind of an interesting milestone in itself. Throughout the seminar, please write down your questions in the Q&A box. We will come to all the questions in the end and try to answer as many as we can. So please continue to put in your questions. With that, let's go into some of the highlights of the report. As I said, we have a fantastic uptake of 5G subscriptions in the world, 1 million a day. That means that we're going to reach some 580 million 5G subscriptions end of this year, and all our way in the trajectory to actually reach 3.5 billion 5G subscriptions by 2026. And Richard, you have been looking at these numbers a lot, and can you say a few words on the forecast that we have done this time and the changes in near term that you're seeing in the 5G uptake?
Lower volume by one.
Near term, we are seeing a somewhat stronger uptake than we had actually expected, which is quite amazing. We've been very positive on this. It is a very fast transition, very much faster than previous one from 3G to 4G. Over the long time, looking at 2026, we've not made all that much adjustments in the forecast. We still have a very high 5G share there with 3.5 billion subscriptions.
But if you compare directly with 4G then, and how that was taken up, why is 5G so much faster? I think we're set at one point that it's almost 2 years ahead of where 4G was at the same point in time. What's the main driver and reason for that?
And the main driver, or maybe say 1 year out of those 2 years, is the fact that China is in the forefront of 5G, whereas China was a bit later on LTE. So that's half of the difference. The other difference is partly because the technology step in handsets is somewhat smaller from 4G to 5G than 3G to 4G. It's really a massive step. And the availability of lots of handsets that are actually priced is really important to drive the subscription. But then also somehow the technology develops faster and faster.
And then a sign of that take-up is, of course, that we already have more than 160 service providers around the world that have launched 5G to date, which talks to this. Going into detail of the report, before doing that, I just want to highlight a new slit that we have done in this report that we haven't done before. We are starting to talk about the Gulf region and actually broken that out of Middle East and North Africa. And the main reason for this being that that region with countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Oman, Bahrain, Kuwait, those are, part of the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, are among the first in the world to launch 5G. They have very high smartphone penetration. Over 82% of everyone there are using smartphones. It's the region actually today with the highest monthly data traffic per smartphone. Over 18 gigabytes are used every day on average in that region. We'll come back to that a little bit later. They have a lot of initiatives within the region that actually drives the ICT uptake. And I think that also means that we will see 5G coming quite fast. It's an uptake of 5G that will account for 73% of all mobile subscriptions in the region by 2026. So bear that in mind, that all the graphs that you will see later on will also have a part which talks more about the Gulf countries. But we'll come back to that a little bit. But if you then go to this graph and expand it a little bit, here we have the transitions per region. And the interesting thing is, of course, that there's a couple of regions that are very much in the forefront of 5G. North America is expected to have 84% of 5G subscription being 5G subscriptions in 2026. Because when you see that development in North America, what is it that drives that, and as you see it?
It's a very competitive market with very strong operators, very purchase strong consumers, and the expected situation for 5G in 2026 really mirrors what we see in LTE today, where North America has a very high proportion of LTE.
So I guess it's I guess it's the regions that today have a lot of 4G subscriptions that also are expected to be in the forefront of 5G.
Absolutely, and that mirrors, broadly, it mirrors standard of living, GDP per capita, and the advanced levels of technology overall in society. So in that sense, it's not surprising. Then, of course, it's driven by the fact that there's a conscious decision to go for 5G, competitive pressure from the operators, frequencies set aside by the regulators and so on.
Looking then further detail into the North American market, we are right now expecting that by the end of 2021 there will be around 60 million 5G subscriptions in North America. Of course, that including United States and Canada. And by 2026, we expect this to reach 360 million subscriptions in North America. And at that time, 4G will have declined, and basically there will be only 4G and 5G on that market. Do you see any, if you look at this uptake, is that surprising for you in any way, Rickard?
No, I wouldn't say it's surprising. It's to be expected. This is a very strong region with new cellular technology, so this is what we expect.
Comparing then the different regions, we have created a graph here which looks at the 5G subscription share by region in percentage. And here you basically see from 2019 up to 2026 when the different regions passed the 10% share or 20% share. Right now in the lead is Northeast Asia, very much driven by China, as we heard about before. Then we have North America and the Gulf countries, and a little bit later than Western Europe, and then followed by other regions, of course, that it takes a little bit longer for 5G to be mainstream. But if you look at the 4 regions on top there, there's probably an interesting development. First, still in Northeast Asia, in China, that is declining a little bit. They're ahead now, but are declining over time. What can you say about the development in China or Northeast Asia?
Well, they are growing very strongly now, but we do expect to see a longer tail of 4G in Northeast Asia compared to, say, North America. And that explains slightly lower growth rate at the end of the period.
And if you look at Western Europe, that is right now a little bit off to a slow start, but then are growing over time. What's the situation you see in Western Europe?
Well, Western Europe is somewhat behind the other regions here, and that's due to a couple of different reasons. One is that the frequencies have been allocated a little bit later. Another is that Europe is a more complex market with many players in many countries that need to make their own decisions to go for 5G, whereas the other regions here, North America, the East region, and Northeast Asia, are compared to fewer countries that operate, so it's easy to get out and running.
And I guess we should highlight also that regardless of exactly how the different regions are uptake is, it is still in generally faster than 4G was, very much driven by the fact that there are so many handsets available early on, as Rickard talked about, and also that device pricing are coming down, which is some of the notes here on this slide. Going forward, we can look into also fixed wireless access a little bit, because that's an interesting area which we are trying to follow and as much as we can in the report. Right now, we have seen over 70% of service providers globally have a fixed wireless access offering. What can also be said is that the 5G service providers, the ones that have launched a 5G service, 9 out of 10 of these have a fixed wireless access offering, basically almost 90%. So it is very clear that the operators in the forefront are also going for fixed wireless access in different ways. And we expect that to reach some 180 million connections in 2026. That would represent almost 650 million individuals, because a connection here is usually to a household, which then are more people in it. When you look at the development, Rickard, in fixed wireless access, and especially the fact that 5G will start to more and more take over here in terms of additional fixed wireless access connections, what's your view on the 5G pickup rate here on fixed wireless access?
We expect most of the growth to be in 5G going forward, obviously because that's the more attractive technology to offer, in particular fixed wireless access, so there's also spectrum being made available. However, there's also a lot of fixed wireless access traffic in subscriptions in regions where there's not yet 5G, so there will be some growth in FD as well. And the change or upgrade, if you like, from a 4G to a 5G modem in a fixed wireless access situation is not as sweaty as with the handset. They have a longer lifespan.
And of course, this has an effect also on the traffic that we expect over the mobile networks. This is a graph that we have had in the report since the start of the report, almost 10 years ago. And it basically highlights the amount of exabyte that goes in globally through all networks in the world. And the line here represents the year-over-year growth rate, which right now is around 46%. It's been hovering around 50% for the last 5-6 quarters. And it has gone up and down depending on what has happened in the market in different instances. Rickard, what do you say about the growth rate here? Is 46%, is that more low rate, or is it expected to change in any way going forward?
Well, it is expected to change. I mean, there are very, very few things in the world that grow with 50% per year for any length of time. And here we're looking at expect it to go down. This is 50% is a combination of still growth in the number of smartphones and the traffic per smartphone driven by improved video resolutions and more streaming activities and so on. So over time, we would expect it to go down to maybe 20-30% per year.
Going then to what this means then, based on your forecast on the future, we're basically saying that this is going to increase with a factor of 5 total mobile data traffic in the world, and of course the interesting part is of course how much 5G will drive all this, and then right now our forecast says that over 50% of all the mobile data will be 5G by the end of the forecast period. And that's the orange part here on the graph, and the more yellow part is the basically the 4G traffic, and then you have the purple fixed wireless access on top of that, which adds another 20-25% traffic in the end. Remember, there's far more fewer fixed wireless access connections than there are smartphones in the world. Still, they are expected to drive a lot of more traffic per device, and therefore that impacts the traffic in a significant way. So going, putting this a little bit more into on the smartphone side and looking at it per region, we can have a look at this graph that kind of depicts then the growth rate in traffic per smartphone, or in gigabytes per month. And interesting enough, we have right now the Gulf regions on top with roughly 18 gigabyte usage per month, and even more than that. And then we have India being secondly with around 14.6 gigabyte per month on average in those two regions, which is of course quite a lot. Is it surprising, Rickard, that these two regions are on top right now? And how do you see the future of these regions?
Well, it is surprising, but by now it's not new, of course, that India is so very, very high. That would not have been expected by most industry observers 5 years ago. But that is where we are now, and in many ways India has shown that the connection between, say, GDP per capita and traffic volume per smartphone isn't as strong as we originally thought. The Gulf countries is, of course, a very special case. 6 countries, very high GDP per capita, very well developed. But it's also interesting that if you look at these 6 countries, you can basically divide them into 2 groups, where one group is having very much less traffic than 18 gigabyte per month, and the other group has around 30 gigabyte per month. And then obviously their price plans are correspondingly what kind of answer. So even within such a broad group, each market is its own within the particular competition that's created by the operators on the ground, so to say. And the regional number will always be an average. But we expect to see very strong continued growth in these markets, even with these very high levels. And obviously, as we get up towards 40-50 gigabytes per month, then we also expect to see some more AR, VR type applications really driving very high traffic. This will not be caused only by spending more time watching video on them.
No, and that's a good point, leading us to look at North America, of course, again, and see where that is expected to be. 48 gigabyte on average in North America by 2026 seems to be quite a lot. What is required for that to happen?
That probably requires that we get a significant amount of XR or AR, VR type services into the mix. So we don't only have high definition and standard definition video as main drivers. Yeah.
And this is, of course, then still only cellular traffic in our estimates here. But if you compare 5G usage or 5G consumption with with 4G consumption? Because many of these regions are expected to have a lot of 5G subscriptions or share of the subscriptions being 5G by the end of the period. How much more extra traffic do a 5G user consume than a 4G user?
It depends on how you compare. If you look at data from South Korea, for instance, where it's well-reported regulated data, there if you compare a high-end subscription, unlimited high-end subscription for 4G and 5G respectively, the traffic on the 5G subscription is maybe around 25% higher. So substantial, but not to the total difference. But if you compare the average 5G subscription and the average 4G subscription, then it's more than a factor of 2. But that's not really a fair comparison because we can't expect all the 4G subscribers to not only jump to 5G, but then also jump to the most expensive plan. So we need to compare across similar plans. But it will definitely drive traffic further and it will allow a lot more capacity in the network.
Going over to another topic, which of course always is interesting, is IoT. And what we're mostly are tracking in the report is cellular IoT, the IoT that goes across the mobile network, whether it's the legacy part or more massive IoT, which is narrowband IoT Cat-M, or whether it's more the broadband type of IoT, which is more of a modem using normal 4G or even 5G technology. We have done an update and actually reduced the forecast a little bit compared to what we said in November. Can you explain a little bit on that?
Yes, it's a bit strange, but 2020 became a little bit of a lost year in this forecast, if you like. That's mainly due to the fact that China, which is very dominating in the numbers here of cellular IoT, they have had a year where the operators have spent a lot of effort on upgrading subscriptions from 2G to 4G, and in that process also cleaning out a lot of inactive subscriptions. That's also aligned with a policy to focus more on revenue than merely subscription numbers. All that in total led to very low growth in China, and one major operator even had a negative net adds, whereas we've normally seen like 100 million plus. So that basically pushed the forecast 1 year out.
Before going into the next section of this presentation, I'm just going to end up with saying a few words on network coverage of especially on 5G, but also on the other technologies. As you see here, 5G is expected to increase its coverage from 15% of population being covered end of 2020 to almost 60% by end of 2026, and having more than half of the world's population living in cities, you can imagine that this is even far more than just cities being covered. And some countries have gone out with expecting nationwide coverage within soon, and of course this is reflected also in these numbers. Just the last question, Richard, if you correlate coverage to subscription uptake, are they totally directly correlated in the sense that if you have coverage you get connections, or can that vary in some way?
It can definitely vary. Obviously you need some kind of coverage to get the first connections, but then the way we and everybody else count subscriptions, you are a 5G subscription if you have a 5G capable handset in a network that gives 5G subscription. But that doesn't say that there's 5G everywhere you are. So you have to start with 5G in a city center, then everybody with the 5G handset in that operating network becomes 5G subscriber. But obviously the operator will want to build out so that the subscribers remain happy and content. So in that sense, it will follow each other, but not mechanical coverage.
Thank you, Richard. And with that, we will go into one of the main articles we have in the report. And I invite Peter Linder here to tell us a little bit on on the spectrum strategy that T-Mobile in the US have applied, and which links, of course, very much to discussion on coverage and how that is played. So, Peter, take it away and please let us know what this is trying to cover.
Yeah, thank you very much, Patrick. So for those who don't know me, I'm Peter Linder. I'm heading up 5G marketing for Ericsson here in North America, and have had the opportunity this time around to develop this article together with T-Mobile in the US. And I think the key concept here, as we're talking about, is how you're leveraging multiple bands to create the 5G experience. And as Rick had pointed towards a little bit here, the importance of having, you both have to have a 5G phone and 5G coverage and a 5G service, and getting these three things to work well together. So as we were working through this, we'll start a little bit here to the left-hand side of the picture, talking you through a little bit what T-Mobile has been doing. So T-Mobile has been deploying 5G in low-band spectrum, so 600 megahertz across the continent here. And that is 600 megahertz spectrum that is dedicated to 5G services. So it's not shared with other services. It's only having the 5G services. They've also had, through the acquisition of Sprint, they got access to 2.5 gigahertz spectrum. So mid-band spectrum, that is great. And that is 2.5 gigahertz spectrum that is dedicated to 5G as well. And the third, and in addition to that 2.5 gigahertz spectrum, they also adding a C-band spectrum. C-band spectrum was an auction that took place here in the spring for 3.7 to 3.98 gigahertz spectrum. And then the final bit here is about high-band spectrum, and that is in millimeter wave. So that is not used for blanket coverage, but it's more going into specific use places in an area which is a zone which is bigger than a Wi-Fi hotspot, but smaller one what we cover with the classic macro radio. The second thing I want to point out here is a little bit like the kind of improvements or the advantages when you're combining low and mid-band spectrum. So when you're looking at those ones to deliver downlink in the mid-band and uplink in the low band. So it's actually doing carrier aggregation across bands. That we've seen here to be very powerful when increasing both the downlink and uplink speeds. So here you're starting to see that the borderlines between the different band times is starting to get more blurry. And this is on a journey which is essentially about increasing the total capacity of the network by a factor of 14 times to match the traffic growth that Richard was presenting here. And we're also covering in this report a little bit the different use cases that this is going to be used for. The enhanced mobile broadband, so people targeting at a phone and what that means. Fixed wireless access, wireless access both for businesses and for consumers. And also what this kind of technology could mean in rural areas outside of the fiber footprint where perhaps the infrastructure is not up to snuff yet, and where you can combine the 5G infrastructure for both mobile and fixed wireless purposes. When we looked at the performance that this is delivering, we took some figures here from early February that was presented in the first half quarter of the year here, and looked at the green figures here. That is essentially when you do a drive test to drive around and measure across the whole network and don't really care if it's 4G or 5G coverage. So then you aggregate those numbers together. And then the orange figures here, this is what you see if you only calculate the samples when you have 5G coverage. So we see across the border here that we're starting to see that it's pushing up the overall performance and the user experience when we move to 5G here in mid-band. So this is like where you can see what's giving us some ideas of
Try this again.
When you start to see mid-band spectrum being deployed at large scale. If you move then into, in the article, we cover a little bit what are the key decisions that T-Mobile has been taken and to shape their strategy. And I think there's a few learnings there. The first one is that they've gone down the route with dedicated spectrum. So dedicated spectrum in low band, dedicated spectrum in mid band, and dedicated spectrum in high band for the 5G services. Second, they're also very early out in embracing standalone architecture. So affecting both the choices of the radio and the core. layers for what we see as the target direction that everybody would move down the road. Since the 2.5 gigahertz spectrum plays a very important role here, massive MIMO has been like very important piece for driving up the radio performance from the existing towers, leveraging the 2.5 gigahertz spectrum. The fourth one here is the inter-band carrier aggregation. So we talk about carrier aggregation between different bands here, not limited to the
clear out some of that stuff.
Just like spectrum within one and the same band. And the last bit here is talk about voice over NR. Essentially, one of the key things here to be able to drive a strategy like this with dedicated spectrum bands with only 5G is that you carry forward the voice services as well, and that will also have some implications for how the networks evolve over time. So these were some of the key technologies that has been leveraged in this build out. The final piece I want is this little bit about the spectrum and what is the nature of this spectrum, what we're seeing. So what T-Mobile have done has built a foundation layer with low band spectrum, so covering 300 million people, and essentially reaching everywhere. It's I think we're starting to see also where the direction is going, that with the mobile network we get the population coverage up to 97, maybe 98%, and that's what the last 2-3% is absolutely hardest to do anything about. But up to that level you can get with low band. Then the mid band currently reaches 145 million people and being pushed up to 200 million during the end of this year. This is essentially where you see that this is being deployed in urban and suburban areas. And also you're seeing that when I describe it to my mom, I said that this is where you find everything that is like where there's 2 lanes on the road versus low band, which you only find where there's 1 lane on the road, or at least you find it everywhere there is 1 lane on the road. And to give us some ideas where do we see these different types of spectrums in play. And then the top one here is the high band spectrum, and that's typically what we see is in very specific areas. So use a place where you have very high population of people at the same time, or we're trying to unlock unique business values like in a manufacturing plant or a warehouse or a sports venue or something like that. So I think that this gives us some idea how to play when we got all
I hope so.
spectrum types in play. And I think T-Mobile is showing us a little bit what will it look
T-Mobile.
like, what do we expect when we combine these different 3. So this is essentially what we have tried to put the light on here in this article. Back to you, Patrick.
Thank you, Peter. Very interesting. And of course, once we have the coverage in place, it's going to be interesting to see the application of 5G and how that is used, especially within the enterprise space. And with that, I will hand over to Donna Johnson, the Vice President of Product and Solution Marketing in Cradlepoint, to further enlighten us on how 5G is used within the Wireless WAN Foundation. Donna, please.
Thank you very much. And there's an article about this topic in the report as well. An excellent report. I hope everyone gets a chance to read the report in its entirety. And a lot of what we've talked about so far on this call has been the use of smartphones, how smartphone users are adopting 5G, and how we'll provide coverage for those smartphone or basically consumer users. What we want to talk about today is how 5G will really be used in a enterprise context. And by enterprise, we might be talking about government agencies, public sector, nonprofits, as well as businesses. And it's really in businesses that the initial value of 5G will be unlocked, particularly as we're still developing out applications for use by consumers, but businesses already have use today for the full capabilities of 5G. And so we really feel like the role of 5G in the enterprise and it's going to really accelerate the expansion of cellular or the expansion of wireless WAN. And we've seen over the last couple of years, really accelerating during COVID, the use of wireless as an enterprise WAN link. basically providing essential infrastructure to business that allows them to have a much greater agility than what they had before, the ability to open locations where potentially they hadn't planned to be able to move locations, to connect their employees at home, to connect people while they're on the road, and basically, all in all, provide a much more agile business technology that kind of removes that dependence on a wired network. The use of adding wireless or cellular connectivity also reduces overall network downtime. Whether cellular on its own or whether used to augment a wired link, you basically get a much more resilient and reliable network. And it can reduce your overall costs. Because you don't have dependency on those wired providers, you can often cover an entire network with maybe one or two providers within a country. So your network's much simpler, less expensive to operate, and overall lower cost. So this is a trend that we've seen occurring with 4G. 5G is accelerating that trend. And in fact, 5G is spurring interest in cellular in enterprises that maybe wouldn't have considered it before. And all the things that we've talked about during this session are the reasons why 5G is attractive to enterprises. Everything from much higher performance, particularly as we get into some of the millimeter wave and higher spectrum, much greater density of devices, which is very important when we look at IoT use cases. And really a lower latency, particularly as we get into the SA networks. All of these things are going to begin to make cellular a more attractive network than even some of the wired and fiber options that companies are currently relying on. And there's a few enterprises where we see this being particularly important. One is retail, and again, it really, their transformation accelerated throughout the COVID experience as they wanted to expand their footprint. Rather than expecting people to come to them in their stores, they began to really reach out to where their customers are through temporary locations, pop-up locations, and other ways, curbside pickup, other ways of really adapting to the new expectations of their customers. We saw it in healthcare, where it began with things like pop-up quarantine centers, testing centers, vaccination centers, but also through the use of telemedicine and the need to move out of fixed locations and again access their patients where they were and access their doctors where they were as well. And law enforcement is another example where they're seeing the use of cellular exploding and 5G offering up new opportunities for them for things like high-def video for dash cams and video cams, the ability to visualize a city infrastructure or a building blueprint prior to going in or as an overlay experience. So there's a lot of really great uses of 5G, for example, in law enforcement and other municipal types of services. So there's no question that cellular at the edge of the network is absolutely growing. From a technology perspective, there's a lot of reasons why now is the time for wireless WAN and particularly for 5G. And what we're really seeing is that 5G is matching, but also causing transformation within the WAN network. And if we look at this, timeline, we all know on this call that the structure of an enterprise network has been changing over time. And we've gone from sort of a data center, physical location-centric network to one with distributed computing into one with virtualized servers, eventually, of course, moving a lot of those assets into the cloud. And as that occurred, connectivity moved from a largely hub and spoke fixed point to fixed point network into something that had to be a lot more dynamic. Locations themselves became larger. And of course, the destination became multiple cloud services as well as potentially SaaS locations, data centers that might still be in fixed locations as well as those in the cloud. And so the network itself became much more meshed and much more cloud-centric. And that's really given rise to SD-WAN and the need to provide this anywhere-to-anywhere connectivity and a moving away from private MPLS-type networks that were built for that data center infrastructure and into the use of broadband, which allowed much more of that mesh connectivity and that cloud connectivity. We're now seeing this being taken a step further with the increased use of 4G and 5G. The network itself is becoming larger. The number of locations are continuing to grow as we move out of fixed locations into temporary locations, vehicles, at homes, as we move to more IoT connectivity. And so the need for ubiquitous network connectivity anywhere is becoming even larger. And SD-WAN pioneered a lot of those technologies that allowed us to use broadband and cellular networks. And that's going to become even more important as we move to this full wireless WAN 5G-based network. So we really see 5G accelerating WAN transformation, and at the same time, WAN transformation accelerating really the use and adoption of 5G. And as we talk to our customers and other types of companies around the world, we see proof of this transformation. And this was a survey we conducted last year with IDG. And basically we asked customers, how do you feel about 5G? Are you confident in using 5G? And what we found a bit surprising was that 82% of the enterprises we surveyed said they are either currently confident or feel like 5G in the future is going to be a network that they can rely on, particularly for increased speed. And 72% feels like it's going to really start to enable transformation into additional services for them. So not just additional speed, but actually being able to transform the types of services that they provide to their customers or their constituents. As an example, 72% said they are confident or very confident that 5G will be an enabler for things like AI and AR service. And that's really exciting because I think the first wave of adoption of 5G and 4G has been to augment wired links as people begin to develop trust. The second use has really been for moving to temporary and mobile locations, again, as they develop more confidence in the cellular network. Eventually, we're starting to see companies go to a full cellular network as they really embrace wireless WAN. But the next phase of transformation that we're going to see with 5G is an expansion of the types of services that they are able to offer, specifically because they're using 5G. And that's going to be really the culmination of this journey that we're on. And I think that's going to open up a lot of very exciting new uses of the network. And one example of that we highlight in the report is a company called Taylor Construction in Australia. Taylor Construction is a construction company. We don't tend to think of construction companies as being on the technological bleeding edge, but they fully embraced 5G. And they basically are able to use it in their construction sites. Again, they would have a very hard time getting wired connectivity there. And they're not in fixed locations in their sites. They're moving around. They have employees moving around, contractors and things like that. So the ability to have this ubiquitous 5G coverage enables them to do some really exciting use cases. Number one of the things that they're doing is basically visualization, 3D visualization of the building that they're building. So they're actually able to take a client on a walk around the site and superimpose onto it a virtual view of what the building will look like. This gives them a much better way of interacting with their customers. It reduces their overall construction costs because people aren't looking at 2D images in order to visualize what this is going to look for. They also have this really exciting application to increase employee safety, where they actually are able to put a QR code on contractor and employee helmets. And as the contractors or employees walk around the site, they have a series of cameras that are reading the QR code and basically validating that those employees have been through the required training. So they won't allow anyone on site that hasn't completed the training and certifications necessary for safety. And so this ability to constantly be monitoring the employees, correlating it with a database of test information, and interceding very early if they don't have the right training, really enabled them to increase their overall worker safety. And then, of course, they did things that you would normally expect at a site, such as access their applications, their email, their voice services, etc. But this is a really great example of how 5G, as people really begin to take advantage of it, doesn't just provide you more bandwidth. It really provides our customers and your customers the ability to really transform how they work, how they service their customers, how they service their communities. And it enables them to really increase the overall satisfaction that the eventual end customer is going to have with the company. So I think that's the exciting part about 5G. And as I started out by saying, this is really where we think 5G is going to have its most immediate impact, is on this enterprise edge in a wireless WAN, even as consumers begin to increase their adoption. So with that, I will turn it back over to Patrick.
Thank you very much, Donna. Super interesting to hear all the great things happening there. Just before we go into the Q&A, I just want to highlight the fact, as I said in the beginning, it's 36 pages big report here with a lot of deep dive articles, and we won't have time to go into all of them. I'm just going to highlight the other two that are in the report. One is about how AI is actually supporting network development and network design a lot, and especially in optimizing performance due to using digital twins, and how AI then is even improving performance, it's improving or reduce power output when needed, and so on. So we have worked with a few service providers and really applied the AI technology there in order to make sure that the complex world that 5G becomes in telecom is manageable. And the fourth article in the report is another interesting topic, which is in-building coverage. We have for long, almost been forced to use just rule of thumbs in terms of how much of the traffic is actually coming from indoor buildings, from inside buildings. If you look at a macro base station outdoor, a lot of the traffic is coming from indoor, but how much? This article tries to explain that, and because we have a new method using statistics, crowdsourcing data, AI, to actually determine based on the path loss that happens through buildings, how big ratio of that traffic that comes to an outdoor base actually comes from within a building. So please have a look at that as well. Much more details, of course, in the report.
Verizon.
We're getting to the Q&A session. Just if you weren't with us in the absolute beginning, just gonna have some key messages here again. The fact that we are actually passing the 500 million mark on 5G subscriptions during this year means that we have an average of 1 million subscription added every day right now. More than 70% of the operators are using fixed wireless access, and we see that being adopted both for small, medium enterprises and for consumers. And that more than 10 gigabytes of usage is the average now when it comes to monthly usage on a smartphone. And I can tell you, I realized when I saw this number that I'm actually on the bottom half of the world in terms of usage, because I haven't reached 10 gigabytes yet. Let's see, I need to look at more videos, I guess. With that, I would welcome everyone back also to help me go through some of the questions I've seen, and I will start to explain a little bit on how do you see the ratio of 5G subscriptions between mobile devices and IoT devices. Where is 5G happening, and also on the IoT side, when do you expect 5G to happen there, which I guess would introduce URLLC or short latency also on the IoT side.
That one for me.
Not sure I see Richard. Yeah, maybe you can start, Peter, from your end.
Yes, I think a little bit we can see a little bit what's happening on the device side, as given us some kind of indications. Right now we have a little bit north of 800 devices announced, 5G devices in the world. Half of them are smartphones. Another, like if you look at the next quarter, that's essentially the sum of fixed wireless access terminals and Wi-Fi routers. So devices targeting the mobile application, the fixed broadband applications. And the final quarter, that is built up of 19 different types of devices. So I think that it's reasonable to expect that if that serves as a good indicator, we will see those two, enhanced mobile broadband and fixed wireless access, dominate the initial build. And then we'll see it gradually, the IoT gradually grow on top of that one. And where the devices that are available right now are used for very much for vetting the application and get some of the first cases going.
Thank you. Rika, do you want to add anything on that when it comes to the forecast of 5G on IoT?
We've not split out 5G in the IoT forecast, and it becomes a little bit of semantics as well as LTE-M and Urban IoT is going to be part of the 5G standards as well. So end up with a little bit of back and forth there. But I think Peter is absolutely right that the smartphones and the fixed wireless access network are going to drive the volumes in the early years.
Another question I have is on the pandemic itself. The last year have, of course, been quite disruptive in many cases. But Richard, if you look at your forecast and what you've seen the last year, do you see any impact on the pandemic on the data growth or anything like that? And I'll also ask the rest of you the same question on your particular area.
And we've seen,
Richard.
Thank you. We've seen definite impact on the data growth, in particular in regions where there's not so much fixed broadband. Everybody, or a lot of people working from home and the mobile network carrying all the growth, whereas in regions with a lot of fixed broadband, most of the growth came to the fixed networks. And in some regions, we've seen tremendous growth in the number of fixed wireless access subscriptions as well, for exactly the same reason.
Yes,
I think you touched upon this a little bit also. Oh, sorry. So Donna, I think you touched upon this a little bit on in your presentation on how enterprises have, maybe have to adapt a little bit different now during the last year. How have you seen that development?
We saw businesses that maybe in the past would not have looked at cellular either because they were concerned about reliability or cost, turn to cellular as they had to. Again, as their businesses were disrupted, maybe they had to move locations, open temporary locations, allow at-home employees to use cellular. And I don't know how that's reflected in the data. I think that's something that we'll be able to see over time. But it definitely caused people to consider cellular that might not already have done so. And we're now seeing that more and more businesses, having tried it out during the last year, are willing to use it even as their businesses return to normal. Some of the benefits that they derive from cellular that they might not have expected, they're able to carry forward.
I think one comment from my side is a little bit on the what we've seen during the pandemic right now. I think we've been more connected. We have been more dependent on our digital devices, and I think that the introduction here, so not really seeing that go down, rather the interest coming up. But I think we're starting to see that when people now are getting a 5G device, they're going to change out the phone and say, well, I'll pick the 5G device. Kind of a little bit changing their behaviors with the new 5G device, because by getting on a data plan, which is the top tier here in North America with all you can eat data, it's starting to affect how people are thinking about, do I really need to switch over to something else, or do I still do it the whole time? That's perhaps one of the things that I'm starting to see.
Thank you, Peter. And we have a question on how much of the forecasted traffic growth that we expect to come from AR versus video, etc. Can you comment a little bit on that?
Yes, in the early years, 2023, 2024, so on, it would be a very small part. However, as we get up to these, say, the 48 gigabytes per smartphone a month in North America in 2026, then we're going to see probably a substantial part that has to be AR or VR in order to reach those levels. But then again, it's like Peter mentioned, we know that there's maybe a factor of 2 more traffic from a smartphone that goes over Wi-Fi today. If suddenly a portion of that goes over 5G instead because of convenience and suitable data plans, then I will have to redraw the forecast.
I think that it's fair to say that if we look at where we are right now, what has been driving us towards the 10 gigabits is all the way we do our apps and everything like that, and streaming of standard definition video. That's the dominating video format today. So what is going to keep propelling this and take it to the next level is essentially video in higher quality, perhaps not so much more in time per user, but higher quality, which generate traffic. It's the streaming of game towards mobile devices and to a large extent rather than gaming consoles and desktops. And the third one is AR and VR. And when we look at these higher qualities, and so we're looking at a significant leap upwards in the traffic generated. So we don't need a whole lot of increased usage in terms of minutes to start to see it affect the traffic patterns.
And Donna, you had an interesting case there with Taylor Construction using more VR and those type of solutions. Do you see an interest for that using 5G going forward, also in the enterprise space?
Certainly, we hear some of it. We hear it in retail. When we look at things like shopping experiences, we hear it in things like public safety and training as a better way of doing training than in person or standard sort of presentation types of training. So we definitely hear it. It's still a little bit futuristic. Companies are still just thinking about those. The question was about AR versus things like video, and I would say that in the enterprise space, video right now is driving a tremendous amount of traffic growth. Not just the video that people use for conferencing, but use of video cameras on locations, and the move from video cameras being stored on a DVR locally to live streaming video cameras we've seen a huge uptick in traffic going through our devices as a result of that. So if you think about a police car, for example, traditionally they would capture video, store it locally, and only upload it when they return to the station. With 5G, we're seeing the ability for them to be able to stream that video live. So there's no delay between someone in the station house would be able to view the video and when it's actually taken. So you can see how those types of applications really improve safety, community, as well as officer safety, but at the same time are driving quite a bit more traffic through the network.
I think you're onto a very important application here, Donna, because like video intelligence, when you film something in high quality, and then you apply AI, analyze it while things are happening, and then you can suggest corrective actions before things go bad. Those kind of things are relevant in a whole lot of applications versus the model that we have today. You capture it in lower resolution, perhaps not even in real time, and after things has gone bad, then you start looking at it, perhaps applying some forensic experts and really figured out what was going on, but like 2-3 months down the road, versus why don't we try to see if we can leverage this to take corrective action before things going bad, rather than as a tool to identify why it went bad.
Yes, exactly. And again, you can see how 5G becomes a real enabler for that, because to stream high def video takes, I don't actually know how much, but a tremendous amount of bandwidth that would quickly exceed what you would get from a 4G, even a gigabit LTE connection.
Thank you. And a segue from that is to also to highlight that we have a number of digital tools on the Ericsson.com/mobility report page, and one of which you can actually calculate, how much bandwidth you need for running certain applications like high definition video or VR and so on. So please have a look at that. With that, we will wrap up this session, and I will thank you all a lot for attending this seminar. And if I can ask you for one more thing, it is to actually provide your feedback in the survey that will come up after the session is done. And that would be really good to hear your view on what we should focus on all your feedback to the report or this webinar as such. And I want to thank you for attending, also Richard and Peter and Donna for being part of this webinar. Super happy to have had you here, and thank you all for you attending this webinar and dialing in. And with that, we close it for now, and I hope to see you next time we release the report. Thank you all very much.
Thank you much, Patrick.